Hello, and welcome to the Green Profit Academy Pros Podcast. This show digs into the challenges in growing a lawn care and landscape business while maximizing your profit. I'm Christeen.
And I'm Steve Bousquet. We are the green industry experts in profit, growth, and leadership. Hello, Christeen. How are you doing today?
I am good. It's a good day to be a good day. How are you doing?
I am good. I'm really excited about today's topic.
Yeah, thought it would be fun to talk about.
Absolutely. And it's an important topic, not often discussed in the green industry. It's not often discussed in any labor kind of circle, but it shows up every day, every time we bring someone on our team, every time we are hiring someone, every time we're processing payroll. It's there. It's understanding and utilizing labor burden.
Yes. You'd be amazed, like even accountants and CPAs sometimes don't even have, they know how to do the labor burden, but they're not doing it in their business and, tying it to everything that matters. So this is it's definitely one of those, key measures that contributes to so much in a business.
So we're going to be tackling this topic, and whether you're in lawn care, construction, or any trade, understanding labor burden is key to maintaining a profitable and sustainable business. So we're going to break it down today. We're going to go over what is labor burden, all the components, how it impacts your business, and how to manage labor burden.
Yeah. Yep. So I think the best place to start is, for those of us who may not be accountants or don't have that business degree or whatever it is, wherever you're at in your journey, is what exactly is labor burden? And it's more than just the wage, right, that we pay someone or the salaries that we pay, to ourselves or the people on our team. It's the wage and the salary part. It's just the very tip of the iceberg. So there's so much more under that contributes to labor burden. And this is, typically where we see businesses that have issues around profitability is they're not they're not considering anything when it comes to, paying their team, or B, they're just considering their hourly wage. And that's the challenge.
Right. So they're thinking, I paid the guy $18 an hour, so he cost me $18 an hour.
Right. And there's so much more to that, right? So we have their wage, whether it's salary or hourly. It's their payroll taxes. It's their healthcare benefits that you might provide them or contribute to. It's their retirement contribution that you might have in place if you're doing a match or something along those lines. It's workers' compensation. It's the cost for training. You're also looking at, the tools that you have to buy them, right? So if you're bringing a new person on board, maybe you have to buy a new computer for the office if it's an administrative team member, or they're working in the field and they need certain tools, it's uniform. So it's all those things that support the employee actually showing up and doing their job. And on top of that, depending on your business model, we also need to consider overtime. So we don't want to forget about that, because that could be another bleed as well when it comes to your profitability in your business.
And another part of that is like unbillable hours, right? So these are hours that we pay the employee, but we're not charging the customers. And sometimes that can be up to 200 or 300 hours a year. So what that looks like is we paid someone 2,000 hours for the year, but when we look at how many hours they actually worked in the field that we billed clients for, it was only like 1,650 hours or 1,700 hours. So that is also part of your labor burden. And that is where a lot of people can miss when they're doing their estimating, is that they're missing 300 hours. Now, 300 hours might not sound like much, but if you have 5, 10 employees, now you're talking 1,500 hours. Or if you have 10 employees, that's 3,000 hours that you are not collecting payment on over the year. So who pays for those hours? That comes out of the business's profit.
Yeah. And those hours that you're talking about towards, they're not producing revenue, right? That's going to be, it could be administrative hours. It could be training hours, and it could be a combination of all these things. Paid time off, mandatory sick time every year. It's like some states have a minimum of 40 hours, 48 hours of mandatory sick time that you have to pay out. The paid time off, things like that. So anything that you have in your company where you're paying an employee to, work per se, or those benefits need to be included in that. So it could be several things that are contributing to, the paid hours that are not productive and not generating revenue in your business.
Right. And if you go to, like, we have Connecticut Nursery and Landscape, they have a summer field day and a winter, session. So that's 2 days there. And we have Connecticut Nursery and Landscape Association. You go to that, that's another day. So these hours start adding up if you're going to those. And, you should have your people being trained and educated, and you should be attending these. And I'm all for that, chamber events, but you're going to want to make sure that you're accounting for those hours.
Yeah. And I agree. It's investing in that training. Don't do it because you say the business can't afford it. Know what you want to do, have a plan in place, and build your pricing model using your labor burden to make sure those things can happen in your business. So if we plan ahead, we can create the business model that we want. We just have to be aware and know, what do we need to know to create that? Because it is possible, and it's possible to be profitable while you're doing all those things.
Right. So just to let you know, we have regular listeners on this podcast. If you master the labor burden, you're going to be ahead of about 90% of all business owners, not just lawn and landscape, all small business owners in America, probably the world. Seriously. They just are not aware of this. It's kind of one of those hidden costs that sneak up on people, and they're like, why am I not making money? I'm charging this. And this is the hidden cost that really bites the small business owner.
Yeah. So let's talk about why labor burden is important. And really, why should the business owner care so much about labor burden? It doesn't sound like anything exciting. It's kind of a simple process, but it is something that you have to take time to work through. I'll definitely say it's not one of the most difficult tools, but it does take time because you're gathering a lot of information. And the reason why it's important is we're using the labor burden to really manage costs in the business. So be aware of, what are we spending or paying out to have the people here to produce the services that we provide. And then we also use this labor burden in our pricing strategy. So if we don't know what it costs to provide these services, then you could really be underpricing your services that you're providing because you don't know what your floor is. Like, what's the minimum? And are you building profitability into that? So it helps establish a pricing model, and it helps us be aware of our cost as we continue to scale and grow a business.
Yeah. And that's just knowing your costs, right? And making sure that your pricing that's how you remain sustainable in the business in the future, right? Because there'll be creep as you increase paying people. If you're not increasing that percentage of labor burden along with that, you'll be wondering, where's my money going? And it's a percentage here and a percentage there. Next thing you know, you're further and further behind.
Yeah, it also allows you to do a pricing and profit analysis on the services that you are providing and who's providing those. So it helps you give that deeper insight of, is this the right price for these services, or is this profitable? Should we continue to deliver these services? So it tells you a lot of information. So once you get it built out, it's one of those things that continues, to give you a ton of insight.
Yeah, once you know it, you can't unsee it either. It's once it's out of the bag, you're like, how much does that cost me an hour? Typically, an average percentage in the green industry is about 27%, according to a lot of the different trade magazines. So if your average, if you're paying someone $20 an hour, you're going to multiply that times 27%. So $5.40. So, $25.40, right? But it depends on your state. It could be more in the Northeast. We pay over 7% for unemployment on the first 15,000. Our workers' comp is higher, so it might be different in the middle of the country. So it could be 32% for if you're in the Northeast. So you have to know your very specific labor burden cost. And we have a more generous, package for our employees than some other people. And other employers have an even more generous package than us. So you really have to do your own homework.
Yeah. And I would say if you don't know what your labor burden is and you're not tying it back to your pricing for your business model, then typically where I see that the pricing model is coming from is either emotions, or they're pricing out of, I can only charge this much because of, the industry, or the market will only support this, or, I couldn't charge more than that because my competitor, so it's that comparing your pricing to your competitor, which is really irrelevant to your business model. So we want to know what's the pricing model for your company, and let's base it off of facts and not emotions and assumptions.
Yes, I cannot tell you how many times I heard, well, I can only get $50 an hour for mowing, right? And I mean, and they wonder why their costs are $64 an hour, but they can only get $50 an hour, and they wonder why they're struggling. And it's like literally the more they work, the further behind they're getting. And there's the recipe, right? So you're negative $14 an hour for every hour you work. Let's figure out why we're not making progress.
Yeah. And I would also say that looking at the labor burden and having it as a tool, in our company and getting it set up for other companies is the other thing that we've used it for, is kind of like this reflection, right? So we have benchmarks in our company, we're measuring things, and we can look back at how the business has, how we have scaled and grown with our growth over the last several years. And it gives us insight to those changes, the investments in our innovation and our efficiencies, to where we can see what have we added and where has our labor burden increased. And we have seen by looking at this information and analyzing it. Now, mind you, we have a team of, strategic accountants who love to analyze this information because we do work with companies to scale and grow their business. But what we found was there was some investments that we made in the company that were big investments that increased our profitability, right? And our labor burden went up just slightly. So it allowed the team to be more efficient and more effective in what they do from that investment. So it was like kind of this insight where we're like, wow, we've done all these things over the years, and what's creating that increase in profitability, and how are, the billable hours increasing? What's contributing to that? And it gave us the insight of, well, we didn't have this in place, this software, whatever it was at that time, or this training program, and now we do. So we can kind of see the impact of, tracking that labor burden over time and the investments that we've made in our overall growth and profitability with our company.
And you can have, the labor burden can impact you, because if you're having less turnover, so like you're going to pay taxes on for unemployment, the first 15,000. So if you have, once they get past that, you're not paying the unemployment. But if you have high turnover, every new hire, it's that first 15,000. So a lot of turnover means you're paying on that first 15,000. So you also want to pay attention to, what's the company culture, what's the turnover rate. And then you have all this training, which means you could have more overtime because you have all these new people. So you could have less overtime by having more people that have more benefits, but then you don't have the overtime. So it's like there's a cost analysis that you have to do there. Like, okay, more people with more benefits, but less overtime and less workers' comp and less unemployment. So, you have to look at those costs.
Yeah. And you wouldn't be aware of it unless you were tracking it. and you
Right.
can look back on it. So it takes, again, kind of that guesswork or the assumptions out of the changes and the strategies that we're implementing in the company, because we can look at the facts. So I always like that. I always like the facts. So how do business owners actually use this information? So we understand what it is, and, we know why it's important. So how are you going to, as a business owner, like how would you use this information? And I know, Steve, you have used this information in your company. We work with clients and have conversations around, how to build out their pricing model and other things. So how have you used the labor burden in your business?
So, like for our hardscape crew, because we do landscape too, we know that labor burden, we know our costs for our hardscape crew, right? So they're a talented team. It costs more than, let's say, the planting crew, right? Because there's more detail. They are operating bigger equipment. There's a little more skill level. So that's a higher paid crew per hour each. They're full-time guys all year round. So when we're pricing our hardscape crew, it's based on what that crew gets paid. So it's not just based on like what our competitors get charged per square foot. It's based on their production rate and what they get paid. Now, they've been with us for years and we know their production rate. So they are also very skilled and talented and have a very predictable production rate. So it enables us to, really dial in on the estimating. So, it allows us to be as competitive as we can be based on their dollars and their production rates. But we know what that is. I actually don't care what our competition charges. I know what I have to charge. And then we get good at selling what we sell, right? We don't sell against the clients, against competition. We sell what we sell. And then for our lawn care applications, the same thing. Like we know what we have to get per technician. So if you have a really experienced technician that's a higher paid, we know what he has to generate per day. And if you have a new hire, right, maybe they don't have the experience. It takes them a little bit longer until they learn the yards and the routes and all the techniques and tricks and just ways to get things done. We know what they have to produce per day to hit the numbers that we need from them. So everyone's not the same. Everyone's going to be treated a little bit differently with their expectations based on what they get paid. And, the labor burden. So when you're having conversations with people, you can set those expectations with them. And it's also in our budget. Like they know you want to get this amount, this is the expectation for the production rate.
Right. So what I hear you saying is you're using it for different divisions and services that you provide based off of what you're really paying them. And you know what to charge to make a profit and to cover their costs and everything else. And then you're using it when you're estimating out a project or offering a service. You're also using it to give insight on expectations of how long, how much, and you're considering, in addition to that, their experience level, because typically the more experienced, the faster they are and the more efficient they are.
Right. Yes. Yep. So a brand new lawn tech, like we just had someone today that went out for the first time by themselves after 6 weeks of training, right? Onboarding. And we don't expect that production rate to be the same as someone that's been here for 10 years, and even though they were being trained by someone that's been here for 10 years, it's going to take them time to get up to speed. But so we know what, when we're doing our budgeting, if we have X amount of person new and X amount of experience, what that looks like. So yeah, it's setting realistic expectations. Now, because they're new, they're also not at the same pay scale as a 10-year person, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a reality of those expectations, but everyone's clear on that right up front.
Yeah. And I like that too, because you're building the whole process of them in your company, like growing, getting faster, becoming more efficient. That's built into the pricing model. There's the expectations tied to it. And I also like the fact that it gives them a path that, depending on the length and the training at the company, that they're going to get from this many hours and profitability to this many hours in profitability. So you can kind of see and know ahead of time, as this person grows in the company and they gain more experience, these are kind of, the benchmarks that they will be expected to hit over time. And it allows you to clearly communicate that.
Right. So year 2 is another benchmark, year 3, year 4, about year 5 is about when they kind of will, hit that. They should be at 100% capacity, right? Which is a long time, but it really is interesting. It does take time to learn where to park the truck, where to pull the hose, where to turn, all these different things, how to spray when it's like at that 8 or 9 mile an hour wind, right? Because most chemicals you can't spray above 12 or 13 miles an hour, or some are 15, but even once you get to 8 or 9 miles an hour, and how often to clean your filter and your tips, and there's a lot of nuances involved in that. For when you see a tech that can spray 230,000 feet a day versus 150 or 60 from a brand new tech, there's a lot of little things that are going on. But you expect that improvement. It's just like, why are the desks so small in first grade? Because you can only stay there for so long, right? You can only fit in that size desk for so long. It's the same thing with that first year tech, right? You can only stay at that production rate for so long and before you're expected to move up.
Yeah. And I also like that, what you're sharing, because it gives you the information to show a new employee that comes in as a spray technician, what the journey of mastery looks like in this industry, and how that could be interesting and how that could be great. And it doesn't have to just be like, oh, you're a lawn application technician. No, like there is some skill and talent that gets developed over time to where your level of a lawn application technician really grows to a higher level.
Yes. Yeah. And it helps when they see there's no junker cars in the parking lot. No one's driving a beater. That helps to kind of, motivate people. But right. And they're talking to techs that have been in the industry for 20 years. We have people that have been here for years and years. So that helps them to see that there's a path for more money, more opportunity, more responsibility.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that tie back to this. We're talking about estimating projects, right? Intentionally building in the profitability, because we know what our costs are per service and also per level of technician that you're talking about here. It then ties into the financial planning side, and then the strategic planning and decision-making side, to where we know if we grow and expand, that we might need to hire someone who doesn't have the experience. What does that look like as far as the timeline and development, the profitability, the costs? So, all of those things, it ties to several things in the business that makes a huge difference. And of course, it all ties to that budgeting. So over time, as you continue to scale and grow your company, you're going to know, what are my costs with my top tier guys? What are my top costs with my entry guys? In this service department, whatever that is.
It's very helpful. And, the better you can pay people, the longer they stay. So knowing these costs just helps you have a stronger culture and a stronger workforce.
Yeah. And it's going to then tie back to the pricing model, to where, we need to make sure that we're considering everything. Because I would even say, working with some business owners, or their managers, creating the labor burden and looking at things, sometimes they might forget something because there's so many pieces, right, that support hiring someone, bringing someone on board, employees. So making sure that if you have that process for your labor burden in place, then you can be aware and make changes as the change is happening in your company. So maybe you add retirement. Maybe you add an additional, tiered time off, depending on their time of employment, which is very attractive. After so much time, their paid time off continues to grow. So if we have a process, we can make those changes and make sure that the company doesn't fall into the red, because you are scaling and growing your company, and also giving your team members more opportunity for those benefits and growth.
I had Steve with Green Profit Academy. I was just reading a Harvard Business Review study that showed people who have written down goals and plans make 10 times more money over a 10-year period than people who don't write their goals and plans down. And really, that's why I'm so excited to announce the Green Profit Academy Mind Your Own Business Retreat. This is going to be the third retreat we're putting on. It's going to be held in Granville, Tennessee at the Wildwood Resort and Marina. It's going to be on November 4th to November 8th. And we're going to work on not only your 1 year, but your 1 to 5 year business plan and goals. So you're going to be so far ahead of people who don't have written down goals and plans. We are doing this because we want your business to be far more successful than you ever imagined. And it all starts with goals and plans. So join us this year, November 4th to November 8th for the Mind Your Own Business Retreat. Let's see. Come on, sign up. I'm going to put the link to sign up in the show notes, and I look forward to seeing you there. It's time to get serious about your business. Now's the time to start. Yeah, you have to pay attention to it. It's if you, like I said, it's one of those things. Once you're aware of it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah. And it's also, I think it's one of those processes that once we get it in place and you just keep checking on it regularly, then it's easy to maintain. It doesn't have to be hard.
No, it does not have to be hard. But sometimes, and like you just said, sometimes you're like, hey, I want to add this extra thing. How much will it cost? And then how do I pay for it? Right. And so sometimes you can say, if I want to do this thing for my employees, I want to make this where my company more attractive work. It's only going to cost $1 an hour. So but what do I have to charge? Like, what's my margin of markup on that? Right. Because just because it only cost me $1, but now I have a margin of markup on that. So now I have to charge my customers, X. So what does that do to my pricing? And how does that affect me in the marketplace?
Yeah. And is now the time, right? Because what you offer at, let's say, a $500,000 to $1 million revenue generating company, that cost can significantly decrease at more of a 3 to 5 or 5 to 10. So it's not about, can we, do this? It's, can we do this right now? Is now the time? And if not now, then when? Right. So it helps you with that, growth in the future of, okay, at this revenue level, we can add this benefit, and it's going to be a margin of the cost versus double. Right.
Yes. Oh, there's things we offer now that I could never have dreamed of offering before. Like one of the things we do, if you get married in our company, we will pay for your tickets for your honeymoon, right?
Wow.
The airfare. We could have never done that 30 years ago or even 20 years ago. That would have been like, what? And it's just an unusual type of benefit that we do, that we offer. And it's a nice conversation piece. And they're like, they do what? But that has to be in our budget, right? So but the challenge is we don't know when or who's going to get married and all that. So we just have a fund for that. So a percentage of the money goes into that fund.
Yeah, which is nice.
It's a labor burden.
Yes. Yeah. So, to include those kind of things. So I want to talk about how to calculate this, because I think this is, how to calculate it. And we're going to go over an example, which is kind of a bigger topic and is going to help the listeners understand, what does this look like and how does it work and how does it come together? Because we can talk about what are all the costs and all that stuff, but how do we put the pieces together? And how often should you, look at these numbers? So one thing is regular reviews, right, are important because things change in the business. Somebody leaves, somebody gets hired. We might need to add a training program or a safety program. You might, end up getting an increase, mid-year on a cost or something like that. So typically I would suggest, keeping an eye on it for quarterly adjustments. And it's as simple as, did anything change that will impact our labor burden? What are some of those things? So having that list, so you don't have to remember what are those things, right? So it's that easy go-to kind of process. And then definitely annually, we want to look at it. So we want to check on this every year to see what big operational changes happened in the business. Like maybe you're going to add a new software, to the company that supports your field crew, something like that. So, new piece of equipment. Is there a new service that we added? We need to adjust and look at the labor burden for that. Is it different, even though it might be similar to a service you're already providing? So quarterly, just kind of do a check on it, and then annually do, a detailed review and update any changes that you might have. This gives you that space to do pricing adjustments, on an annual basis if you need to. So then you can talk about price increases and inform your customers about those. And these are going to be things, when we're looking at the labor burden, direct costs in the company, indirect cost, and the overhead plays a big part in this too. So once we know how much it costs for our employee, right, to do the service, then we need to figure out, okay, what's our overhead costs going to be with this? And then how do we build profit in it? And that's how you get to your pricing strategy, which could be a whole nother podcast. So we're going to stay focused on the labor burden to not complicate things. So to calculate this, we kind of went over it earlier, is you're going to sit down and you're going to make a list of all the things, right? So wage is going to be at the top of the list. Our payroll taxes. So this is going to be Social Security, Medicare, federal taxes, state taxes. Steve was talking about, unemployment, right? Everybody's unemployment rate is different, and even local taxes. So I know, even because I worked with clients who had businesses in California and San Francisco, they had district taxes associated. Oh yeah, so much fun with payroll, right? So you could be working on a couple blocks in one area, and if you went one block over, there's a whole nother tax associated with just being one block over, depending on how.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was a nightmare how the city was divided up. So really being aware of like what your payroll taxes are and your local taxes are is important. You might be lucky and just have it, real simple. But some places are not that simple. We also look at health insurance costs, retirement contribution costs. We were talking earlier, paid time off, the workers, compensation. That's important. Like, how much are you paying? You have different rates for different employees. You have a different rate for a laborer than you do for an admin person typically, right? Depending on the job. We have training costs, uniforms, safety gear, tools, equipment, maintenance and repairs. And then again, here we have overtime. We don't want to forget those. So this is where a lot of the work comes in, is gathering this information. And I'll have a checklist that we will include in the description that will help you, like, how to gather up the information and how to do a labor burden calculation, just a short list to support you in this. So don't worry about writing all this down or having to go back later and re-listen to the episode for all of these items. So we want to add up all these costs. Okay, so what are all these costs? And we're just, for this scenario, we're going to use a total of $55,960 in costs. Right. So that's what we're going to use as the number. So with all of this, costs associated, that everything I just list off, that's our number. And then what we want to do, and Steve was kind of talking about this earlier. So I'm glad that he brought it up, because, we coach around this topic, is we want to divide the total amount here by how many hours this employee will provide services, right? Not how many hours are they going to work for, right? We want to look at their services. So let's say, for example, they'll provide 2,000 hours of service, and they'll work or be paid for 2,080 hours. So we're dividing that $55,960 by 2,000 hours, not 2,080 hours, because it's going to give us the correct labor burden of the amount of hours of service they're going to be paid for to actually deliver that the company is going to be paid for. I like to call those simply billable hours, right? So hours that we can bill and we're going to get money for. The other hours are the hours we're paying them for, but they're non-billable hours. So they're not hours that we're going to get paid for a service. So we can't go charge a customer for those 80 hours. But we want to make sure those 80 hours are going to be paid for in some way in our company. And this is where, when we're doing an assessment, we have found several times where the company's bleeding. They're like, I don't know why I'm bleeding. And then we're looking at their hours, and they're not just looking at their labor burden associated with the cost and the hours that are being delivered as services.
Yes, I think that is the most common one, is that they paid for 20,000 hours and they billed for 15,000 hours. That is one of the most common bleeds that I see. And they're like, what are you talking about? Literally, it's a blind bleed. And we have to get that fixed quickly. And they'll do that. Companies will do that for years and years. I know I did it for probably 15 years before it was shown to me. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. Okay. Ouch. That makes sense now. So yeah, it's definitely a bleed. And I think it's a bleed. It's interesting because it's a bleed in almost all businesses. It's not just the lawn care landscape, accounting, doctors, mechanics. It's almost in every single business. They have that same bleed.
Yeah. And I want to kind of share if this really happened in a business, right? And bring in like a real example here. So if we had a technician that was earning $40,000 a year, and once we add the taxes, then we get to that $55,960. There's that gap of $15,960, right? That isn't accounted for just from the cost of wage and all those other things. So if we calculated our labor burden off of that $40,000 versus that $55,960, we're throwing $15,960 out the window. There's that. And then imagine that you calculate that 40,000 off of 2,080 hours and not 2,000 hours. And then that going out the window. So there's this, just like, you hit an artery at this point and just one employee. So this is a very typical area where they're going, I don't understand, I'm not profitable. And then we go back and we look at some very basic, from our perspective, basic things that are the foundation of pricing in a business. And we already found, easily that $15,000, almost $16,000 plus, the additional 80 hours that we're looking at with the labor burden difference.
Yeah. So a lot of times when we work with business owners, right, we find usually $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 of revenue opportunity, and people will be surprised. And it's usually, this is how we find it. It's hours that they're paying people to work that they're not charging for. And it's right in front of them, and they're not doing it, right? They're not finding it. It's because it's not something they're aware of. So we've gone over this before in other different podcasts. I think even a couple of years ago, I've talked about it quite a bit, and this is where the bleed is. Yeah, I'll say it again. I've said it a couple of times. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it.
Yeah. And when you're talking about $80,000 to $100,000, Steve, that's typically one project.
Yep.
It's not, over a year time, right? So it's like a project that lasts, a couple of weeks or whatever it is, or it's one one analysis that we're running with one employee in the company and what they produce. So it's really, a drop in the hat with all the other opportunities. So if you, play that forward in the analysis, the financial analysis of the company, and let's say we have 10 projects a year at that rate of loss, times that by 10.
Yeah. And here's the scarier part, right? If we don't get this stuff dialed in, you're talking about multi-millions of dollars over your career. Between now and when you stop, you are losing multi-millions of dollars by not having this figured out. And that is when I was like, oh crap, I have to get this dialed in, because I'm not working 45, 50 years and being broke when I can just figure out some math and have bank at the end of my career and have, a nice life when I just can do some math.
Yeah.
I had to get help. I had to get a lot of help, coaching, and but I was just like, I'm not working that hard and being broke because I'm afraid of my math. And I, which I was, but I had to admit my fears and get over it. And now I'm like an expert in this. So once you realize the life it can provide you and the feelings that come with that, you will fall in love with it.
Yeah. And invest in the time, to do it. And so I wanted to kind of walk through, just to give our listeners, because I know you're probably driving or you're doing something else. And I kind of want to break this down on a journey here to talk about, like, if we only used salary, right? So that salary based of $40,000 a year, based off of 2,000 hours, that's $20 per hour. But if we then turn and look at the labor burden that's associated with it, pulling in that $15,960 gap that we were just talking about, which is that $55,960. And then we look at 2,000 hours based on that amount of money that's being spent. That's now $27 an hour and 98 cents. So the gap between using our wage and using our labor burden is $7.98 per hour. So, that could be a pretty big gap. So if we're looking at, let's say, that difference of that $7.98, and if we calculate that by a service hour and we're using salary, let's say it's $45 that we're charging for 1.5 hours of service versus what we should be charging of $68.37 for that half hour of service, right? So there's a big difference when we're looking at a base wage and using those hours versus the labor burden pulled into it. So the potential revenue loss is $23.37 when we're only using salary. And if we're looking at an annual basis of, let's just say 1,000 hours, right? Not even 2,000 hours. That's $23,370 that you're losing just from them working half of a year, from using a base labor wage versus a labor burden.
Imagine that. Imagine that. And then run that out over 10, 20 years.
Yeah. And this is just with one employee.
Right.
So
right. If that doesn't keep you up at night.
And this is why it's so important to understand, like, what is my labor burden in my company and how does it tie to what we're pricing and what we're charging our customers? And it doesn't have to be emotional. We want to get with the facts of what we're charging, because it really helps you feel better about what you're charging, right? So it takes out that emotion and go, well, if I'm spending this much and I need my profit margin to be this, and I need to make sure it covers my operational costs, it makes sense. Because otherwise you're just here doing it for free. And that's not why we're in business.
You're paying to do it, actually, right? I mean, it's beyond free. You're actually paying to do it because you're paying it out of your opportunity costs. You're actually paying to do it, which is even more painful.
Yeah. And this has a huge impact on the profitability when we don't have this dialed in. So it's going to you're going to have cash flow issues. So if you're having cash flow issues right now in your business, I would say, look at your labor burden. Look at what your pricing is. Go through, the download that we're going to provide you, that checklist, and see if there's something jumps out at you. And if it doesn't and you can't quite see it, then I would say sit down with your accountant, sit down, with your financial person who supports you, your CPA, whoever that is, or even I would say, maybe set up a call with us and see, like, what am I missing? This is what I have. What would it take to get this sorted out? And I know, Steve, you've provided coaching and brought people through just this concept of walking them through their numbers and getting their pricing correct.
Yeah. And it's very revealing. Sometimes it's actually hard for them to believe. Like they literally they'll sit there and they cannot believe it. And then they don't sleep for 2 nights. And then it's hard for them to wrap their head around what they have to charge. And then coming to grips with changing their prices. And some don't. They move to Egypt so they can be near the river Nile. And then they'll live in denial for a while, the Nile River. And then they have to come back to reality, and then they make the changes. Others go, oh crap, and they change the prices the next day because they're sick and tired of being broke and making excuses and living off credit cards, and they don't want to work the next 20 years the same way. And they like snap, and they're like, boom, I don't care. This is what I got to charge. This is what I'm charging. And then a year later, they're like, oh my God, this is the best lifestyle I can't imagine ever going back to that. So, and then there's the other third that go, oh yeah, I'm happy being broke and suffering and being the victim, and I'll just continue on that path. So, there's just different types of people that want different things and want to live a different life. Right. So, and they all get there in their own way, but yes, I'm reserved to accept the 3 different types of people: the people that will not change and they'll live in misery, the people that will firecracker change and make the prices, and the other people that will have to kind of, live in it and then make the changes slowly. So, to each their own, but it is the people that end up making the changes a year, 4 quarters later, they are happy. Yeah, that is for sure. It's a different lifestyle. It's a different mindset when you're making that kind of money. And it's not just that 1 year, it's the rest of their career. And it's the opportunity that provides their family is what they're happy about.
Yeah. And what really kind of inspired me to talk about this was I got an email from a reader from the book. And, she's been in business, her and her husband, for over 8 years. And there's a lot of things that they're doing right. She read the book by Profit First by Mike Michalowicz. She's reading, the Profit First for lawn care and landscape businesses, and shared, like, it makes a lot of sense, like the way that I laid it out in there talking about. And I start with labor burden, and I start with, really tying it to your pricing and the margins, right? Your margins and markup. And then I brought in some of the Profit First stuff. And that's because that's what I saw in working with people. It wasn't about overspending in their company. It was more about that their revenue wasn't supporting their costs because there was a huge gap in pricing, and I said, set up a consultation with us. We'd love to see how we can support you or help with this issue that they're having because they're just not profitable. But the first thing that I thought of in reading her email was their pricing is wrong. There's something going on with their pricing. And it could be fixed. And even when we're looking at pricing, this labor burden, Steve, like you were talking about, we know the expectations in our different service departments that tie to how much they should be producing per route, per week, per month, per year, and what those are, because you're pulling them back and connecting them to the true costs of the company and building your pricing around that. That's the process that went through my head. So I was like, oh, if we could just fix that in her company, then profit won't be a thing that they're missing anymore.
And so one of the things that people will go to is we just need more sales. The challenge with more sales is then you add another crew and you add more people. But and I did this, I just needed more. I needed more crews, but I added another crew. So I take another truck payment, mower payments, everything, but I still wasn't charging enough because I wasn't recovering over the labor burden, the overtime, paying hours that I wasn't charging for. So the more crews I added, and read Profit First Lawn Care and Landscape Businesses, you'll hear my story, right? The more crews I added, the deeper in debt I got. And I could grow the business, but the more it grew, the deeper in debt I got. And it was because it was my pricing. It wasn't sales, it was pricing. So that's why I'm so adamant about getting this pricing right and this labor burden, because I literally I was selling myself broke.
Yes.
And it was all about pricing. So now I work with people. I said, hey, how about we increase, we're going to increase your profitability without adding a new service, without adding another person, without adding a truck. We're not even add a customer, right? Matter of fact, we're going to get rid of your cheap customers that are costing you your future and a fortune. How about we get rid of all those people that are taking advantage of you and your family? How about we start there? And I don't know if I want to get rid of the people that are, ruining my future and my family's future. Nope. We're going to start there. And so then they do it and they're like, oh, they didn't care about me. Nope, they never cared about you. So, how about that? How about we make a better business without adding any more employees or any equipment or a new service, the new offering, right? We're going to offer tornado shelters or, ponds or curbing or whatever else. Some people do great at those things and good to them. But, if you're not doing that already, you don't need to add that. You can raise your prices with what you're already doing and be fine. And, the people that do offer those services, they could probably raise their prices and do even better.
Right. Yeah. So it's extremely important to, know the facts about your labor burden and integrate it into your pricing model, right? So we need to know what your labor costs are per hour, per the service that you're providing, right? Like Steve was sharing, this technician is going to be paid differently than this type of technician. And why? Because they cost more, right? It could be the skill set. It could be the years that they've been working for the company and their experience and how quickly they do the job. And then we want to look at the overhead. So how much does it cost in the company to run the company? And then we bring in the profit margin. So we're not just done at the cost of labor when it comes to pricing. We have to make sure that we include the overhead in the company, and then we need to build in the profit. And that's how we land at how much do you charge for X. So it's not just like, well, let me see what my competition is building. Well, this feels like the right price, or, I couldn't possibly charge more than this per hour. So we don't want to do that. We want to really break it down, get the labor cost per hour, get the overhead, the total overhead. You can calculate it per hour based on your total costs and the total, production hours. And then we want to build in that profit margin. And this is what's going to ensure that your business covers all the costs and it's profitable.
Profitability is everything. And, when those new prices go up, you might have to learn how to sell at those new prices, but you can learn how to sell at those new prices, right? And that's just another skill you're going to have to develop. But it's a lot easier to sell something when you're making money I don't know how to explain that, but it's like, hey, it's really hard to sell things when you're losing money, but it's a lot easier to sell. I don't know if it's an energy, it's a smile when you're selling something you're making money on. Hey, this thing makes me money and I'm going to bring money home to my family. It's just so much easier to sell. For me, it is. Than, hey, I'm going to sell this thing that's costing me money every time I do it. That's such a hard sell for me. So if you need help with that after you raise your prices, call me. I will help you with that. We'll get to that. We'll solve that problem. But definitely learn your labor burden and make those changes.
Yeah, it's hard to sell things that you're salty about. So.
Oh, yes, it is. It's so painful. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Hey, if you're go to our YouTube channel and subscribe, right? And hit a like. It helps us if you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends in business or whether they're in the green industry or not. This is really about business, and everything we talked about today is applicable to not only the lawn and landscape business, but all business. So I want to thank you guys for joining us on today's podcast, and we look forward to you joining us on the next podcast. Thanks for listening to the Green Profit Academy Pros Podcast,
the show that digs into the challenges of growing a lawn care and landscape business while maximizing your profit.